Hi everyone, I can see people starting to join the meeting now, which is wonderful. But yeah, it's lovely to see so many of you here today, and hopefully we'll be doing a really interesting session. At least we think it's quite interesting. We hope you do too. To start off with, we're just going to do some quick introductions. So I'll start with myself because I'm speaking. My name is Niall Rundle. I'm one of the portfolio managers at Taylor & Francis, where I look after our medical education and bioethics journals. I've worked with AMEE since 2019 on Medical Teacher, and recently over the last year I've been working very closely to oversee the process of moving MedEdPublish from its current platform onto its new F1000 platform. When once that's kind of transition is complete in a couple of weeks' time, that'll be joining the rest of the portfolio with Medical Teacher, Medical Education Online, Teaching and Learning in Medicine, etc. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by two colleagues who are much more impressive than myself. So firstly, Barbara, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. And it's really nice to be here today. And I'm looking forward to these discussions on open data. It's definitely a subject close to my heart. I'm an academic at Norwich Medical School. I teach genetics there and also look after part of our faculty development programme in the medical school. I'm also a member of the MedEdPublish Advisory Board. I think I first got involved with the journal in around 2016, 2017. And I acted as a guest editor for one of the themed editions about life sciences. And I've been a member of the main editorial team since 2019. I have to say that the reviewing aspect of the work has become a really important part of my personal scholarship in medical education. So thank you. Good to see everyone.
Thanks, Barbara. And we're also very delighted to be joined by Rebecca Grant.
Thanks, Niall. So my name's Rebecca Grant. I am Head of Data and Software Publishing at F1000. A lot of my work has focused on rolling out increasingly strong data sharing policies across journals, and also in supporting authors to comply with them, so to understand and comply with data sharing policies. I've also done quite a bit of training for researchers in terms of understanding these policies. My own research is actually in the humanities, but using social science methods. So I think a bit of intersection with the way that some medical education research is conducted. We ran this session previously, so in August, and it was really enjoyable and we had a great discussion at the end. So we've tried to build in a bit more time just to ask questions and have a conversation. So really looking forward to talk to you all about data sharing.
Thanks, Rebecca. Do you want to put up the slides? I should also say that we're joined as well by a couple of members from the team from AMEE. I know Kerry is here, Claire is here as well. People are around. Brilliant, thanks, Rebecca. I can see those now. I assume everyone else can as well. Start again. Do the thing all over again to say welcome. Thank you very much for coming. And for those of you who joined a little bit later, and we're delighted to have you today for today's webinar, where we're going to be really focusing on increasing transparency in medical education research through using open data and through data sharing. And we hope that this session will be a really good introduction for those of you who maybe have not come across open data before, who've not had the chance to implement it themselves, and even for those of you who maybe have been having these thoughts about whether they want to make more of their data open, and maybe have questions. This will hopefully answer some of those questions, but also give you a chance to talk to some people who have a little bit more experience. And particularly, Rebecca is an absolute superstar and really knows a lot about this, from the perspective of someone who really looks after this from a publisher perspective. I think it's very helpful. As has already been mentioned, we ran this session previously at AMEE 2021, and it was really well received, but because it was run as a workshop, it wasn't able to be recorded, and obviously in amongst the conference schedule, not everyone was able to attend, so we've kind of decided to run this again. We've asked to run this again as an opportunity for more people to see, to hopefully ask their questions and really get involved. I will say that throughout, please feel free to post questions or comments in the chat. And there are a few of us, when we're not speaking, we'll try and answer them. And if we don't answer them during the session, we'll try and answer them at the end. We really are delighted to have so many of you here. I'm just going to give you a quick run through of what we're going to talk about today on this next slide. Brilliant. So first, we're going to start by having a little bit of a discussion about MedEdPublish, which many of you will already be aware of is AMEE's open access publishing platform. It's been around for several years. And that journal is moving to a new platform later this year that's going to have an open data policy. And that's why we think it's a really good time to speak about open data within medical education. And this will hopefully give you some of that background to that. This session is going to be about open data in general, so it's not really MedEdPublish specific, and hopefully it's applicable to everyone. It's able to answer a lot of people's questions and comments. After that, we're going to really dive into some of the detail, talking about really what is data in MedEd research, and then how would I share that data transparently, safely, ethically, and what benefits does that have to myself as a researcher, but also to the community as a whole. It's quite a big topic, but hopefully we're going to be able to cover it pretty well. After that point, we have a breakout discussion where we put into separate groups for, I think it's 10-15 minutes. Small groups, I think it's about 5 people per group, where you'll be asked to sort of comment and discuss some of the themes, talk about your own experience of data sharing, your own questions, your own comments, your own observations, and to contribute to a Padlet board. This, if you've not used them before, is a kind of virtual whiteboard space where you can add questions, comments below questions. We'll go over it a little bit when we actually get to it. The link will be circulated in the chat, and then hopefully we'll be able to discuss the outcomes of that breakout session and answer any of those questions, discuss some of those comments, explore some of those themes with you all. The end of this session is kind of quite open. We have some slides, but really it's about building on the Q&A. We want this session to be about you as attendees, and if you have particular areas that you want us to focus on, we're happy to do so. I think that's a relatively good overview to start with, or at least it's covered a lot of things. So without further ado, I'm happy to hand over to Barbara, who's going to give a little bit of a background to MedEdPublish.
Thanks very much, Niall. So you'll recognise the sort of branding for the journal on one half of this slide about what the MedEdPublish project has been all about and how it's worked as an online journal. So it began life, I guess, within the AMEE community nearly a decade ago, but it's been a sort of fully online, separate, open access journal since 2016. It's been a great success. So academics, teachers, clinicians, researchers and students have all used the journal to publish really a very wide range of scholarly articles about health professions education. So there's been original research, teaching tips and opinion pieces over the years and conference reports. So it's a fully open access journal, and I think that's one of the great things about it. All users of it can read and download and copy and share articles, which are published under a Creative Commons license. So I've listed a few things on this slide here, four things that I'd really like to highlight as the kind of big advantages of MedEdPublish that have always been part of the ethos. And these are big advantages with respect to transparency. So the first thing to say is that MedEdPublish remains the only sort of open access post-publication peer-reviewed journal in the field of health professions education. And I think that's a really important thing to explore. So the post-publication peer review follows an open identities principle, so feeding into this idea of transparency. So all reviewers will submit their feedback attached to their name, and readers can see all aspects of the peer review process with the reports, referee names, comments, and have been able to join the discussion thread if they wanted to. The second important issue for the field is that there's a light touch editorial policy sort of developed by the editorial board. And this has reduced editorial bias about what what is and what isn't published. Because all of the articles that meet the formatting requirements and the research governance sort of ethics requirements that also fit with the topics expected for the journal will and have been approved for publication. The third thing that I want to stress is that I think that the model used has really enhanced individual and community scholarship. And that's certainly been the case for me in my work with MedEdPublish. I think that the open discussions around health professions education, has been very democratic. And the fact that all readers can have access to the conversations around articles has been an important part of the model. And finally, and this is where this is really important with respect to data sharing, this is a fully online journal. And that's important because, there's nothing to stop the facilitation of sharing all detailed methodology, all detailed data, and the tools used to collect that data. So there's no sort of limit to the pages that you might have in some other journals. So you can have extensive supplementary files attached to articles, and I think that's been that is a really important aspect of open data sharing. As a reviewer, I've noticed that not everything that could have been shared regarding methodology for articles and complete data sets has been shared over time. And it's something that I've often mentioned in reviewer feedback. But I think this is where the new platform and our F1000 association is going to be really helpful in the future periods and enhance this aspect of transparency and open science. So that's what I wanted to say, and I'll hand back to Niall now to look at developments for MedEdPublish.
Thanks, Barbara. So as I think Barbara covered really well, a lot of the ethos behind MedEdPublish has been about openness, about building a community of research that respects that peer-to-peer model that academic publishing is really meant to be based on. So it's the idea that one piece of research builds on the other, and that peers are able to comment and review and accredit each other's work. And I think hopefully that the new technology and the new platform only adds to that. And I think that's part of the reason that AMEE chose to go in this direction. And in doing so, it's not about AMEE. AMEE hasn't given up control of MedEdPublish. In fact, it's still very much the driver, but hopefully the technology of F1000 and the experience that we bring as a publishing team can only add to that. So what we're adding, what's happening that makes MedEdPublish a little bit different? Well, firstly, we're going to be increasing the speed to publication with the back end and improved technology that F1000 can bring to hopefully make sure that you as an author, when you submit a paper, that it gets published as soon as possible. I think our guidelines that we try and get it within a couple of weeks if a paper is ready for publication to get out and be published, which I think is a really wonderful thing in a very fast changing environment. It continues to be a fully open access journal where everyone can see and view the content. They can see the reviews, they can see the articles themselves. And this complies with all major funding mandates, including Plan S and DORA, and in fact, several of the world's largest funders of academic research, including the European Commission, the Wellcome Trust. They actually use similar technology based on F1000 for their own publications. We're also going to be looking to see if there's new article types. Barbara mentioned the idea that an online journal really shouldn't be constrained by the ideas of pages, and they shouldn't be constrained by what it publishes and the types of things that it publishes. And so we'll continue to have new different types of article, not just reviews and short reports, but also data notes, software tools, things that are different and which take advantage of the fact that this is an online publication. As Barbara said, a big part of the whole MedEdPublish ethos is author-led publication. So there's no rejection here for a perceived lack of novelty, for publishing an article that has null findings, or for having authors who are inexperienced. As long as the authors meet the basic requirements of kind of the academic requirements around plagiarism, around ethics, around whatever guidelines there are, the article is safe to be published. That doesn't mean necessarily it will go on to be indexed, because it needs to pass peer review for that to happen. But what we hope is this is a very open resource that lets people gain experience in the publication process, where often in traditional journals would see them rejected time after time after time. And the open peer review model further expands that by allowing authors to see the reviews that are coming in, to respond to those reviews publicly, and then to revise their article as many times as required in order for it to be indexed. And I think that revision aspect is really important as well, because it's so often as an author, I'm sure you know the experience of getting back a rejection which is very short, which doesn't give you the opportunity to grow. And MedEdPublish is all about that learning through publishing opportunity. And finally, we're talking a lot about openness, we're talking a lot about transparency. That openness extends to the data, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. And that's why, we're talking about MedEdPublish in the context of open data and data sharing as a whole. So MedEdPublish has an open data policy, which states that all articles published on the new platform should include citations to repositories that host the underlying data behind the article, together with many details of software used to process those results. This should mean that any other researcher or reader who accesses the article can look at the data themselves, can analyze that data themselves, can, if they should wish, look to replicate that data, and in certain circumstances, even reuse that data. Why we think this is important, what we think this does for the community, is really turn the whole process of doing research into something where people get credit for. So you'll be able to be cited for the research. Apologies, recording's in progress again. You'll be able to build on the work of your colleagues, you'll be able to access that work. I think that is hugely important. In terms of what this means for authors, it means that we do ask for this and we do provide help on our website and through our editorial staff in doing this. But if an author doesn't provide their data and doesn't provide good justification, then it won't be published on the platform. And that's a hard rule. And I think it's something which is quite brave of AMEE to do, but I think it's very progressive. I'll also add as a final point that there are exceptions to this, because clearly there may be cases where openly sharing data may not be feasible because of ethical, data protection, confidentiality concerns. And in those situations, we clearly wouldn't ask authors to do anything unethical. I mean, quite the opposite. And there are clear guidance that I think Rebecca's going to talk about a little bit later on in terms of how you anonymize data, how you share data safely. So I hope this has given you a good overview of why we think open data and data sharing is something that's of immediate importance to the medical education community. And I'm going to pass over to Rebecca, who's going to speak a little bit more about actually what data means and discuss how you would be able to share it safely, transparently, and openly.
Thanks so much, Niall. I'm just going to quickly stop sharing the slide deck because I'm worried I'm sharing the wrong window. Okay, let me reshare. Yeah, so I would start by saying, having worked at other publishers, this is definitely one of the strongest data sharing policies that I've seen at any journal. So in publishing on the MedEdPublish platform, you're encountering one of the strongest possible data sharing policies that you'll find across any journal. So that's why I think it's really important to speak both about how you can achieve that. So what do you need to do in a practical sense to make sure you're complying, but also about the benefits. So why is this something that we ask our authors to do? And what are the benefits to you if you do it? So just to make sure we're all on the same page about what research data is, in the context of the MedEdPublish policy, research data could mean a number of kind of more granular things. And I think most of us would probably initially think of research data in the context of a publication as being that data that you produced for the purpose of the study that you're reporting on. So in the course of your research, you generated some data, you're now writing a publication that discusses that data. So maybe that's the research data that we're asking you to share. I would also note that we're interested in seeing you share data produced by others. So if you did reuse somebody else's data set, if you found data in a repository, if you contacted another author and asked them, could you integrate their data into your study? We also want to make sure that that is openly shared. And then additionally, we would be looking for things like open sharing of materials produced for the purposes of the study, and also any code or software. So as a whole, we're looking for replicability of research, reproducibility. Could somebody read your paper and reproduce your work? If code and software is an important aspect of that, then we want you to share that as well. So if you come to publish in MedEd, on the MedEd platform, you'll read our data policy, and you'll see that there are a number of steps that you're being asked to take. So before you publish, you should be preparing your data for sharing, and we will give you some guidance on how to do that. Part of that would be selecting a repository. We would also expect you to add a data availability statement to your article. And then we would ask you to link data that's shared in a repository to your published article. So as an author, if this is something you have never done before, I think actually while these steps sound simple, you might find them somewhat challenging. So I'm going to talk through what all of this means. When I started preparing for this presentation back in August, I decided to look on the existing MedEdPublish journal to see, well, what kind of data were researchers talking about? What kind of research methods were they using? So these are all examples that are taken from real publications, slightly anonymized. And I picked them completely at random. So I think these were just the first 4 or 5 that I saw on the platform. So in our first study, we have somebody describing participants, completed application forms, and then pre-course, post-course, and daily evaluation questionnaires. In another study, we have participants who were being asked to experience and evaluate, I think it was an app, and then the results were discussed in a focus group. Another study used anonymous online surveys, and another one using semi-structured interviews with medical students. So you can see, looking at these research methods, you could be generating quantitative data, so something like those evaluation forms, qualitative data certainly, so focus group discussions, for example, or maybe in one study you're producing both types of data. There was also a variety of formats, so I imagine there was some text, possibly some audio, maybe even some video files, and then in conducting the analysis, perhaps some transcripts were created. And also in reading the papers, you could see that these were often sensitive topics being discussed. So for example, one of these studies was looking at the experience of LGBTQ medical students. So if this is the type of study that you're conducting and the type of data that you're generating, you might have a number of questions or concerns around how you would share this. So if you're working with human research participants, you're generating what might be sensitive data, probably you have concerns about sharing this openly. So you might be thinking, well, my participants didn't consent to sharing their data. They didn't tell me that I could share it, so I can't share it. Maybe you're concerned about legal implications. So you've heard of something like data protection legislation or GDPR, and you're worried that you're going to have to address this in your data sharing. Or maybe you just think the topic of your study is too sensitive. So the type of research you're doing is looking at a very sensitive area, and there's just no way you could share that. Additionally, I think there are challenges associated particularly with qualitative data sharing. So quantitative data sharing as well, but qualitative data has its own challenges. So you might be thinking, well, how do I anonymize this? What am I supposed to do with a video that will make it safe to share? Where am I supposed to even store this as I go through this process? If you have something like audio and video files, what are you supposed to do with them? Is a journal asking you to share that or not? So I've broken down some guidance on how to address these challenges into 4 steps. I guess they might look like simple steps, but as you go through the process, you might not necessarily find them simple if it's the first time you've done this. I would also say, depending on your institution, you might have additional support. So there may be research support staff, and particularly in the library, who can help you with this. There's also a lot of guidance available, and I have some links later in the slide deck out to some guidance you might use. But at a high level, these are the things that you will probably need to do. So firstly, plan for data sharing in advance. So that means before your study begins. Seek consent for data sharing from your participants. When it comes to sharing, make sure you're sharing the data appropriately. And then finally, something that Niall alluded to, describe any data sharing limitations in your data availability statement. So I'm going to talk through what all of these mean in more detail. So the first thing was planning for data sharing in advance, and it is, I would say, crucial that you do this. You're going to find every step that follows much more difficult if you haven't planned in advance for data sharing. So I have created a data management plan on the slide. This is something that your institution or your funder might require you to do. Some of you might have had to do this already. I would also say that even if it's not a requirement from your funder or your institution, it's something that you can do yourself. So it's kind of like a project management plan, but for data. And there are templates available, and they will help you to consider your methods of data collection, where you will store the data as you conduct the research, different team roles. So do you have someone in your team who might be a bit more familiar with data sharing? Any discipline-specific guidance that applies to you, and then importantly, how you will share the data when the project ends. And if you do create a data management plan before you start your research, you should ideally keep that up to date as your research progresses. So you would keep going back to it, make sure that you're aligning with what you had planned to do, or that if your research has changed slightly, that you update your plan as well. Benefits of doing this, it does make it more easy to comply with funder and institutional policies. So you're planning from the beginning to be able to comply with any data sharing requirements. It's very helpful to prepare for data sharing and publication from the beginning. And I think this last point is the key one. It means that you will have informed consent from your participants. So I'll explain more what I mean by that. So our second step is to seek consent from your research participants before the study begins. And I'm sure you are familiar with the concept of informed consent. So if you are recruiting participants for your study, you will be telling them exactly what your research involves, and then they will, in understanding your research, be able to provide that informed consent to participate. So if you want to share data, you need to add something about future data sharing so that your participants can provide informed consent for that as well. And this is why it's really important to plan in advance, because in order to request informed consent from those participants, you need to tell them what you're planning to do. So if you plan to do something like anonymise or de-identify the data set, if you know where the data will be stored, if you know who you will allow access to the data, you can tell your research participants, and they will then be able to give informed consent for that data sharing. So you really need to know before you ask them what you're going to do with that data. Benefits of this, so it will help you to comply with legal frameworks like GDPR. So for example, under GDPR, which is data protection legislation in Europe, having consent is a legal basis to store data. But you'll need to inform yourself about data protection legislation where you are. But I also think it's really important and necessary in order to share data ethically. So you will see still examples of researchers sharing sensitive human data where they have not asked the participants for consent, but best practice is that you would ask them, even if the data will be anonymized and they can't be re-identified, you should ask your participants for consent. So our next step, and this is getting, I get into a bit more depth in terms of practice and techniques. This is where you come to share the data. And there are a couple of different ways you might choose to do so. So you want to share it safely, excuse me, and protect your participants. And there's a couple of methods that you might use to share the data in an appropriate way. So having created your data management plan, having received participant consent, there's a couple of things you might choose to do. So you might decide to anonymize the data, and I'll talk about what that means, or you might decide to deposit the data into a controlled access repository, and I will talk about what that means as well. The benefits of this is it will protect the privacy of your participants and safeguard them from harm, while also allowing maximum possible reuse of your data by other researchers. So if you think about what you're trying to achieve here, you're sharing your data in a way that's as open as you can, because you want other researchers to access it, to potentially be able to reuse it. But in doing so, you need to make sure that you're protecting the privacy of your participants. So anonymizing the data or using a controlled access repository are the two best options that you have to achieve both of those aims. So let's look at what that means. If you have not anonymized data before, this is a very high-level introduction to some of the techniques that you might use. Again, there's a lot of great guidance out there that will guide you through the process in a bit more depth, but I'll introduce you to some of the concepts for now. So what is anonymizing data? It's a process that you will go through that removes information from a data set so that research participants can no longer be identified. When you start looking in a bit more depth at anonymization techniques, you'll see a couple of different terms come up. So you'll see guidance on removing direct identifiers, and you might also see guidance on removing indirect identifiers. So just so that you know what this means, a direct identifier would be information that uniquely identifies a research participant within your data set. And I think these direct identifiers are maybe a little bit easier to identify yourself when you're looking at the data. So if you're thinking about participant privacy, probably you're aware that you might want to remove, for example, full names of your research participants, the dates of birth of your participants, their addresses, their phone numbers, biometric information, for example. So as you start to consider how you can begin to remove identifying information, I think the direct identifiers are a bit more obvious. I think most people would know you should probably take these things out before sharing a data set openly. The indirect identifiers can be a little more difficult to, I guess, work with. You need to really consider what type of information left in the data set would uniquely identify a research participant once it's combined with other information. So indirect identifiers, there are many types of indirect identifier. Some of the common ones would be things like ethnicity, the sex of participants, their places of birth, and their job titles. So you can see if within your data set, you have a person's ethnicity, but none of this other information, probably that person is not very identifiable. When you start to combine it, you're really building up a profile of a person, and possibly someone could identify them. So for example, if I was a participant in your data set and you had my ethnicity as white Irish, I probably can't be identified. If you add that I'm female, if you add that I'm born in Dublin, and if you add that my job title is Head of Data and Software Publishing, I think actually in combination, I'm getting pretty identifiable in your data set. So as you go through some of the anonymization techniques, you'll need to think about what you're keeping, what you're taking out, whether you have now made your participants less identifiable. So a general rule, I would say, is you don't want more than 2 indirect identifiers within your data set. But it's quite dependent on the type of data you're creating. It's a process that you need to manage yourself and make sure that you're comfortable. So these are some of the common techniques that you'll see in data anonymization, and I'm just going through them at a very high level. Again, there's lots of information available about how to use these. Probably the most common one that you'll see is this idea of removing a variable. So for example, if you have something in the data set like latitude and longitude where the participant is located, maybe something like their date of birth, and you think actually for reanalysis, this isn't necessary, you can remove it completely. So again, thinking about the utility of the data set and not wanting to remove too much information, but there are some things you could remove and maybe you wouldn't lose too much value. Another really common one is generalization. So this is making the data point a bit less precise, making it more general. So for example, if within your data set you have an address for your participant, you might generalize that and swap it for a city, a region, even a country. So again, have a think about what would make your data set still useful, still interpretable by someone else, while making your participants less identifiable. The next one is pseudonymization. I find this really useful if you're working with a qualitative data set. So it means swapping names for falsified versions. If you are referring to an individual repeatedly in a data set, it can be useful to give them a false name. So you're not using their real name, but you're still able to refer to them a number of times. It can work as well for places. It can work for business names, universities, for example. And then the final one, again, is you'll probably have come across it before, is creating bands. So again, it reduces the precision. So maybe you would take out somebody's age, swap it for an age range, works for salary ranges. It actually is helpful for lots of numerical data points. So I have a very quick example of what this looks like in practice. So on the left-hand side, I have my quantitative data set that I've anonymized. So in column A, perhaps I had participants' names, and I've swapped that out for a participant code. So I'm still able to refer to these participants, but not using their real names. Column B, where I had date of birth, I've decided, actually, I'm just going to completely take that out. It's too identifying and it's not useful. And then in column C, I've added age ranges. So these are bands. So instead of having that date of birth, I've got an age range from, for example, 20 to 29. So somebody using this data set will still have a sense of the age of the participants, but not the exact date. And then the location, again, don't have addresses, but I've included the region. And this is actually based on a controlled vocabulary called NUTS, which will help you to generalize location data. You can see on the right-hand side, I've done the same thing, but for a qualitative data set. So this is a fake interview transcript. And you can see what's been taken out. It's in bold and we have the diacritic marks. So you can see this person is talking about their experiences of studying during COVID. The name of their university has been removed. We assume that the place where they're studying has been generalized. And you can see towards the end, somebody's name has been pseudonymized. That's been replaced as well. So just thinking in more depth about that qualitative data, it is certainly more challenging to work with this kind of data if you do want to anonymize it. Just the very nature of this data and the formats that you create it in make it more difficult to anonymize. So for example, transcripts, notes from focus groups, narrative survey responses, it's just more challenging to work with them. It's also more difficult to automate in any way, as you can still identify clues about somebody's identity within the text. So for example, you might remove somebody's name, but actually the person speaking has given so much identifying information about them that somebody who knew them would still guess who they were. And you could see in my example, it's necessary to indicate where changes have been made so that a reader knows that something has been removed. So we saw the example of the diacritic marks. There can also be technical challenges. So if you do have audio or video, they can be extremely time consuming to anonymize. Just the very nature of having to run through an audio file and cut data from it, that is going to take time. And for that reason, it might be useful to include a budget for that in your data management plan. So to plan that you might have, for example, an external resource to help you to do that. But additionally, in doing any of this, the value of the data may be lost. So that's the same for qualitative and quantitative data sets, but removing information might damage the intrinsic value of the data that you've collected. And this is where the use of controlled access repositories might be more appropriate for your data. So if you have never used a data repository before, it is a location on the web where your data can be stored and be accessed by others. It allows you to provide contextual information for data to be reused. So you can add a description of what your data is and how you collected it. It will give you a persistent identifier so that your data can be cited by others. And to me, the biggest benefit is it gives you peace of mind. So the data is going to be managed in the long term by this repository, and it's not you who needs to make sure that it's preserved. Controlled access repositories have very similar functionality, but they don't share data openly on the web. Generally, they require certain access conditions to be met by people who want to use the data. So for example, you might say only a bona fide researcher, a legitimate researcher from another university can access this data. The purpose of them is to protect participant privacy. And by using a controlled access repository, it may remove the need for anonymization. So if you've told your research participants that their data will be available on a controlled access basis in a repository, that might mean that you actually don't need to remove so much identifying information. And then the last thing we mentioned is your data availability statement. Again, if you have not drafted one before, at MedEdPublish, it's a required section of your manuscript, and it's a narrative description of all of the data underpinning your research and where it can be found. And what is useful for sensitive human data is that you are able to include an explanation if there is a reason that the data cannot be opened. So for example, if you did not receive participant consent, you might need to explain that in your data availability statement. Perhaps you have some context from your institutional review board. Perhaps there's some elements of the data that you could share, but not the entire data set. And if you do, for example, have data in a controlled access repository, you might want to give some information to the reader so that they know how that they can access that data. So it's really about being clear, transparent, and just providing an explanation of what this data set is. Is it open? And if not, why isn't it open? What were your legitimate reasons that this could not be shared openly? Sharing. Great, recording in progress. So we said you need to plan for sharing, and that is planning from before you start the research itself. You need to make sure you're protecting your participants and sharing in an ethical way with their permission. Share data using appropriate methods, whether that is more openly but anonymized, or perhaps in a controlled access repository. And then explain in your data availability statement what you shared, or maybe what you couldn't share and why. I have a link here to the F1000 resources on open data, and there's loads of guidance there on things like choosing a repository, what data licensing means, how to deal with spreadsheets, how to write a data availability statement, sharing code. So I'll try and pop that in the chat before we finish, but there's like so many resources there. Okay, and then just to additionally talk a little bit about the benefits of doing this. I think the first one is the most important to me. So it's around boosting your credibility. So if I publish, I always try to share my data openly if I can. And I think it's really important to be transparent. So it really helps people reading my work to understand what I did. And then if somebody really wanted to go to the trouble of replicating it, trying to validate my research, they would really understand my methods and they'd see what data I had generated. It enhances the visibility of your work. So if you have data in a repository, then readers can find both your article, but also your data set in that repository. And we additionally have really good evidence that open data sharing is associated with an increase in citations to your paper. So up to 25%, and that's based on a study that was published in 2020 that looked at 500,000 published papers. I've added a link here to a great piece of writing by Florian Markovets. So it's called 5 Selfish Reasons to Work Reproducibly. And he's talking quite a bit about how to manage your data well and how to share it, and why that's actually a good thing just for you as a researcher going through your working day, like why it's so important to make sure that you look after your data well. So I've created a little short link there if you want to read it, but I think it's also linked on the Padlet, so you'll see it when you open up the Padlet. Okay, so we're going to move into our breakout. You will automatically be placed into a breakout group with other participants. I think there'll be a maximum of 5 in each group. So we have a number of questions that we'd like you to discuss. And we're going to let you take some notes on Padlet, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So the questions that we've prepared are: what challenges have you faced in sharing data? Or maybe if you haven't shared data before, what concerns do you have? Have you identified solutions during today's session? And then are there any other solutions that you require? So you'll have 10 minutes to have this conversation and to make some notes. And when you go into the breakout, you should see which number group you're in. So please make a note of it. This is what Padlet looks like. So we have a link here, and I think we'll pop it into the chat as well. But it's an open space where you can add your comments. So you don't need to create an account to add comments. You can just start typing. It would be helpful if you could state which breakout group you're in as you do that. So when you navigate to Padlet, you'll see I've added an example of what that looks like. And then we'll come back after 10 minutes and have a bit of a discussion about some of the answers that you've given.
So welcome back into our sort of plenary group session now. And what I want to do is to bring up some of the queries that have come up on the Padlet discussion forum. Now, I hear that not all of the breakout discussion rooms worked for you for various reasons, but hopefully we've collated quite a lot of shared queries on the Padlet, and all of you can look at that later. And some of us will probably make comments later on, well after the session finishes, to wrap up discussion. So such is the joy of synchronous and asynchronous delivery of teaching sessions these days. But I want to start off by bringing up a couple of queries for Niall and Rebecca to discuss with me in relation to things that came up in the chat stream before we even started the breakout discussion. So one of the, good questions that came up that we had to think about was what happens around transcripts in other languages that aren't in English, and what's the expectation with read translations, if that needs to be shared, or does it need to be that granular? So and this would be something that might be commented on in detail in your data sharing statement. So Rebecca, do you want to pick up on that first?
Sure, thank you. So my experience at other publishers has certainly been that there's an expectation that at least the variables would be in English. So as the publication is in English, that people reading your publication would also be able to understand the data that they find associated with the paper. We have the same guidance for MedEd. So that you would translate the variables. We did have a bit of discussion about this over the break, though, because I don't think our policies exclude data sets in other languages. And something else we were talking about was the way that peer review works on this platform, which is that you, as the author, have the ability to suggest your peer reviewer, and you might want to choose someone who speaks the language that you're publishing the data in. We also talked a bit about editorial discretion in these cases. So I think I've had a number of different questions, like really valid questions and comments from authors who have particular challenges in data sharing. And I would say generally at MedEd and at other publishers, like there's quite a bit of editorial discretion if you can explain what your limitation or what your challenge is. And it's also important to describe that in your data availability statement. So I would say the first principle is around transparency. So if you're being clear that this was the language the data was collected in and this is the language that's available in, but try to make things clear and understandable to your readers, then that should generally be enough. But we were also talking about the necessity to make that a bit more clear to our authors. So if you're an author coming to publish, you have data that isn't in English, would you know whether you're allowed to publish it or not? And I think not. So that's an action that I'm taking from this workshop to bring back to the team and have a discussion about, can we make this a bit more clear, what is or isn't allowed? Niall, I don't know if you wanted to add something there.
No, I think that was a really good overview of certainly what we spoke about, and I think the policy in general. I think the point with that is that I think that maybe the takeaway that's broader than even just the specific topic is that, as I'm sure many of you know, because you've joined us for this webinar, this is a new thing for the MedEd community. Really, it's a new thing within publishing as a whole. And so there will be occasionally these like little edge cases or gaps in our guidance that we've got so far. And I think from our perspective, we don't look at those as necessarily failings that can't be corrected, but they're opportunities for us to do better. And I think this really is one where we can say, actually, if our policies and our philosophy is all about openness and letting more people into the disciplines, if we're then end up barring people by the language that they're speaking or the language that they're conducting research in, that's not good enough. So we need to be clear on what our policy is there.
Yeah, and I think coming up with some comments that came out of Group 3 and Group 8's queries, the issue of the data availability statement is an important one, and where there are caveats and problems with full disclosure of things, then that can be accommodated within that statement and understood. But I guess I'm wondering how much analysis of those statements is done and where that fits into kind of editorial decision making. I don't know whether either of you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, so I can comment to an extent. So our editorial team is extremely thorough in the checks that they do. So all authors are expected to include a data availability statement with their article that gives a description of each of the data sets that are underpinning the piece of research. And actually the editorial team specifically read and, if necessary, redraft that data availability statement to make sure that it's as clear as it can be. And I do think at some journals, the data availability statement is a bit of a box ticking exercise. So it's technically a policy requirement, but really nobody reads it. On MedEd, it will be scrutinized. It will be redrafted for you if necessary. You might be contacted about it. The editorial team might have questions for you about it. So I would say, don't worry if it's not completely perfect, or if you think maybe you haven't done it right because you've never done it before, because you'll have help. But equally, don't assume that nobody's going to look at it and you can just write a sentence and no one will notice.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, certainly MedEdPublish, the new platform, we're not publishing articles yet. That will be on 2nd of November. The first articles published under the full set of new policies happen. But we are accepting submissions, and certainly looking through some of those submissions just now, regularly I see notations from editorial teams where they're in communications with authors, where they're discussing things, where they're saying, pointing authors in the right direction, answering queries. and that's what we expect. We know this is a new concept to a lot of people, but I think it's an important one. And I think if you're willing to engage in that dialogue with our editorial team, they should have the resources and the ability to help you through those questions.
So group 7, and I think this also bears, sort of is related to the same thing about the statement. What do you do when you are not permitted to share data? I mean, is there just sort of an explicit statement to make around that?
Yeah, exactly. So you need to give as much context as you can around why you can't share the data. And then again, this is where editorial discretion comes into things. So you need to explain what the issue is, and then the editorial team will decide, have you given enough information? Is this really a reason that you can't share? Because we do have authors still who just would rather not, like not so much on MedEd or F1000 platforms, but certainly at standard journals. I'd say quite a large proportion of authors would just rather not. But if you can tell us legitimate reasons why you can't, then generally that would be acceptable.
And I think what's important for that question is about the reader perspective. So if a reader, the reason why we're sharing data at the end of the day is so that readers and people who are coming into those articles can understand the full scope of the article, can understand the back end as well as the front-facing kind of text. And if the reader of that article can then see that data ability statement that they cannot share for reason A, for reason B, and it is clear and it is kind of makes sense within the context of the article, then that is acceptable, because there will be situations where that's not possible, but it has to provide that clarity.
Okay, so here's a more philosophical aspect of that raised by Group 8, I think. So the question is around qualitative data, and when you start to anonymise, etc., how do you keep the value in that data? We're wanting to share, and we're wanting to sort of enhance the scholarship within the field through this open science process, but there's a problem there, isn't there, for some types of data?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why it's hard to give kind of standard guidance about what you should take out, because actually in removing information from your data set, you are absolutely removing value. Like, why did you collect the data in the first place? Presumably it was because it was helping you to answer your research question. It was giving you more context. So a couple of things I would say about that. Firstly, I think this is where controlled access repositories can be helpful, because there might be less of a necessity to anonymize to take things out. Something I didn't mention, but the controlled access repositories can facilitate, is embargoes. So for example, I've seen repositories embargo data until the death of research participants. And if you are working in a really sensitive area, that might be something that you need to do as well. But yeah, I think there's a real art to anonymizing. And yeah, you really need to think about, well, is there actually value to sharing an anonymized version of this? And I went through this process myself in research I did that was a series of interviews where the people I was talking to were talking about their jobs. They were talking about organizations they worked at in Ireland, and there was just absolutely no way that you could take enough out that somebody wouldn't recognize who was speaking. Like, there was one organization, there's only one in Ireland, and everyone would have known who this person was. And so I decided, well, there's no point in anonymizing this. Like, I can take out the name and I can take out the name of the organization, but it won't, I'd have to take out so much, there'd be nothing left. So yeah, it's a very kind of bespoke process that you go through when you're doing this. And equally in data management planning, so in thinking about what you'll do before you collect the data, that's why your plan might change, because you go through this process of collecting the data and you realize, actually, this person talked so much about like where they work or who they are, that my plan to anonymize just won't work. And that's why you might think of a controlled access repository.
I'd like to say something about controlled access repositories, but from a different field, because I'm sort of used to this idea coming from a genetics background, and open science has been a sort of key principle since the early 2000s with the Human Genome Project. So I'm used to using repositories and having very large data sets, and then there's controlled access given to those repositories to scientists as a result of that. But equally, with our databases of results, I'm kind of used to anonymized samples too, right from the get-go, and that's where the kind of planning comes into it, that's actually designed into the sort of protocols right from the beginning, which makes it easy. But it isn't easy to begin with. It takes a lot of forethought and planning, and I wonder about how the group feels about the kind of necessary friction that's going to come in for us as researchers as we move into this new era for medical education. I don't know if anybody within the wider audience wants to say anything about that. Claire, can you see whether anybody's raised their hands and would like to join the discussion?
While Claire does that, I just want to ask, there's a couple of questions in there that we're talking about kind of the format of this presentation, and whether we're going to be doing more of these in different formats, introducing ideas of maybe when we have published authors under the new format, do we want to involve them? Absolutely. I think this is, MedEdPublish under its new format launches in a couple of weeks' time. And we have really a whole year worth of activities planned around sharing the different ways that the MedEdPublish platform does things differently, and how that can be a benefit to researchers, and how that does things in a slightly different way. And that includes not just this kind of open data and data sharing aspect, but also talking about how peer review is different. And we're really keen to actually get involved and have perspectives from reviewers who have reviewed things in an open peer review manner, and then also authors who have responded to those. So I think it's, for us, this is an ongoing process, and we want the community to be more involved. And I think that potentially now we're at a little bit of an awkward middle ground as we sit just before launch. But I think going forward, certainly speaking with AMEE, speaking with the advisory board, obviously Barbara's a part of, we're really excited for the opportunities to use the complete openness in MedEdPublish to facilitate as many conversations as possible, and to get people's perspectives, and to build on those and build those into our kind of structures.
So are there any, is anybody eager to join the open discussion, Claire, at this stage before we move on to sort of wrapping up?
There are no hands raised, but participant microphones can be enabled if anybody has anything they would like to say.
Okay. Well, what I would say is that we will add to the Padlet after the session, and sort of wrap up any questions that we are able to help with as a group. So we can definitely do that. So if there aren't any comments that people want to make now, then we should probably move to the wrapping up slides. Niall, is that okay?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And obviously I would encourage everyone here, if they do have questions, or I appreciate that actually, despite the fact Rebecca handled it very deftly, data sharing is a really complex, difficult thing to talk through. And you might be sitting stewing on something and wondering working out exactly how you would apply it to your own research, and only come up with your question afterwards. Please do reach out to myself, Barbara, Rebecca. Kind of, throwing them into the fire in this, but I'm sure they're happy to answer those questions. If you want to reach out to us after this, we're more than happy to. I'm just going to do a little bit of closing, kind of wrapping everything up, specifically talking about MedEdPublish. As I've already mentioned, submissions are open already. We've had quite a few submissions already, and we're really excited by that. It's been really interesting to see authors work through that process and do something new. So if you do want to look at submitting yourself, the website is currently open, and we'll be switching over so that the new platform will be the primary MedEdPublish as of the 2nd of November. And on that date, we're going to be publishing the first articles under this new guidelines, under these new policies. So you'll be able to see them for yourself and also participate, to comment on those articles. You may be potentially invited to be a reviewer on those articles. I think it's really exciting for us. Well, as a publisher on the publisher side, but also I know that AMEE and their community are also pretty happy. The new platform as well is a really good place for further information about guidelines, instructions, where to find data repositories, what data repositories work for different kinds of data, where I can find all this. And it's a constantly evolving place, so please do take a look on there. And if you have any questions about MedEdPublish, about submitting, please reach out to me, but also the editorial team via the info@mededpublish.org address. They'll be happy to answer questions, comments, responses, things like that, to really wrap that all up. So yeah, I think that's really it for today. I'm really pleased that so many of you were able to join us. I appreciate this is a lot of information, a lot of data to cram into a short amount of time. Hopefully it's been interesting, and we're looking to share this later on in a video format, so that anyone who wasn't able to make this session, because I appreciate we're a global world and we've kind of plugged this in the middle of the day to hopefully catch some of APAC and some of America, but it's not the most convenient timing. So hopefully, everyone will be able to access this, and there's going to be a lot more resources coming out over the next 6, 12, 18 months about this topic as we look to really engage with the MedEd community. I think if I'm closing up now, which I think I am, given looking at the timing, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Rebecca and Barbara for joining us in this presentation, to Claire and the AMEE staff for everything that they've done to put this webinar together, to allow us to speak to you, and their work through all of this, and obviously for you guys to listen. Rebecca, Barbara, do you have any last comments to make?
No, I'm looking forward to discussions in the review process and seeing the papers coming online, and it's a fantastic platform. So it's an exciting phase of the project.
Yeah, and I would add, following our session in August, I had a couple of emails from participants who had questions about data sharing, and I'm so happy to help anyone who has questions. If you have really specific questions about the type of data you have and you just don't know what you need to do with it, then by all means get in touch. I would love to chat with you.
Magic. Well, in that case, I think we'll probably leave it here. And again, thank you all for coming, and hopefully speak to you all shortly. And in the future, maybe we'll do one of these in person rather than over Zoom. I know I can't be the only one that's getting really bored of doing everything over webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Niall.